Thank you, Val, for joining me today. I'd like to introduce you to our students. This is Val Hewson, who is a long-standing member of Reading Sheffield, and she's very kindly donating her time today to tell us a little bit more about the brief, answer some of the questions that you have devised, and to give us a little bit more background about the group as well. So thank you so much, Val, for being here with me today and taking the time to do this. Perhaps if you'd like to say a little bit more about your involvement with Reading Sheffield.
I'd love to. Hi, Anna. Hi, everybody. My name is Val Hewson, as Anna said, and I'm the website editor for the Reading Sheffield project. And I've been involved since 2014, when I left the civil service and was looking around for something to do, and met up with the people who organised Reading Sheffield, who'd been involved for longer. And they drew me into it because I had some website skills that they didn't have. And also as a civil servant, I'd spent years editing government documents and writing government speeches and things like that. So they thought I could help with the interviews and with the transcripts. The project itself had been going since about 2010. So by the time I joined, all of the interviews had been done. And it was at the stage where we were looking around to interpret them and to put them on the internet and to preserve them so that people like you could come along and look at them and make use of them.
That's fantastic. So you've been involved for quite a long time, and so you know all the ins and outs and everything. So, but you actually joined them. So I suppose, something that we were very curious about was to know what the catalyst was for starting this project. And obviously you must have learned about this from your involvement with the group. So how did Reading Sheffield start?
Well, Mary Grover, who is the chair of Reading Sheffield and the woman who started it and who used to teach in the same department as you, Anna, some years ago, she had been teaching English in schools in Sheffield, in further education in Sheffield, and also at Sheffield Hallam for about a 30-year period from about 1980. And all through her career, she picked up on an attitude that books and reading were very enjoyable, her pupils and her students thought, but they didn't get you anywhere in life. That seemed to be a very Sheffield idea that intrigued Mary a lot, and she couldn't really understand it. Then when she got to Sheffield Hallam, her research was all about looking at 1920s and 30s literature and at the enormous cultural snobbery that there was around literature at that time, and the disdain for mass culture, and the way people like Graham Greene and Virginia Woolf and a lot of commentators looked down on popular literature. And Mary was thinking about this, doing research about it, and she realized that actually probably very few people, if anyone, had ever listened to the voices of readers themselves, the ordinary reader. And so on the 120 bus, as it happens, going home to Fulwood one day, she had this bright idea that she would record the voices of the ordinary reader and research them. And that's what she set out to do through the disciplines of oral history and through Reading Sheffield. And we're not sure, but we think the project is unique. We don't think that anybody else anywhere has done this, although a lot of academics and commentators from other places have found what we've done very interesting.
I've never heard of anything like that. And I think it's quite something, because it's kind of, you're kind of tackling the kind of prevailing views, which were, could be quite detrimental for people looking to read, and that idea that there's a first-rate and second-rate reading and first-rate and second-rate writing. So I think it's really, really important, and I'm so glad that Mary thought of this, because it's a great repository for everybody else as well to tap into. So
Yeah, for me, I mean, I have helped a lot with the interviews and the transcribing them and the audio files that everyone can listen to on our website. But it also set me off thinking about where people we interviewed got their books from. And of course, some of them they bought and some were given to them as presents, but a lot of them were borrowed from the Sheffield libraries. And I've always been interested in libraries. So that gave me a whole new area of research that I could look at. And so I suspect I now know more about the history of Sheffield libraries than almost anyone in Sheffield. So it's given me all of that side of it as well, which has been great.
Yes, and also, I mean, that kind of links the other kind of another aspect of reading Sheffield and of the brief in a way for the students, which is looking at popular fiction. Yeah. So not only are you asking and looking to see people's views, a normal kind of ordinary readers' views on those books, but also you're looking at those books in more depth, aren't you?
Yes, yes, we are. We have an association, Reading Sheffield, with another Sheffield Hallam project, which is called Reading 1900 to 1950, which is all about popular fiction between those two dates. And the Adsets Library has a collection of books down on, I think it's the third floor, which are for reference only, but books from the period that have been collected. And a lot of those and the authors were people who were read by our interviewees. And so it's been lovely to be able to look at the history of those books, look at the authors, see who is popular still, somebody like Agatha Christie, say, somebody who was hugely popular in their day but has been forgotten now, and try and work out why that is, and look at the responses of our interviewees to those people. And then just bringing it home to today, involving students from Sheffield Hallam, your students, Anna, is a way of getting the views and the perspectives of people who were born, 80 years after these books were originally published and read. And it's lovely to see, it's going to be lovely to see what young people, that sounds patronizing, I don't mean to, but what our students of today think of those books and how they react to them.
Yes, and it's all about canon formation as well. So the idea of a canon and why some people, some authors' reputation survives and others don't. So trailing through all the newspapers and looking at what was said at the time, as opposed to what might have been said more recently or not at all. That's a really good. It's a really good project, but also it's a lot of work that other people might then find really useful as well. So, putting all of these together, it's not that easy to find things here, there, and everywhere. I always think of you guys like, like little magpies, just collecting little nuggets of, really special bits of information here and there and everywhere, and making sense of them all for all of us.
Well, I hope so. I have to say we still get excited about it, even though I've been involved for 6 years now, and Mary and others for over 10 years. And we do still ring each other up when we've discovered something exciting and interesting. Yeah. I mean, Mary and I frequently say to each other, how can everybody not be interested in this, in a way that just shows how caught up we've got in it.
That's fantastic. And my students were also wondering in relation to this, what inspired you and the other group members to start reading this material? I mean, was there an interest beforehand, or was there a particular author, I mean, for you personally, that might have inspired you to?
I don't think there was a particular book or author. Lots of the people involved in Reading Sheffield had been involved in education in one way or another, maybe teaching English or teaching history. And interestingly, only one person, I think, is actually from Sheffield. Everyone else came to Sheffield as an adult for reasons of work. So I came because there was a civil service department here, for example. And I think we were very interested in the city that we'd adopted as home. And then, as well as an interest in the social history of the city we lived in, many of us shared an interest, I think, in the literature of the period. And you have to remember that for us, who are much, much older than you and much, much, much older than the students, it was the period of our parents. It isn't a period that's, you know, in deep history. It's not an ancient history. And I've mentioned that some of us were connected with the other Sheffield Hallam project, reading 1900 to 1950. And so we were all interested in the literature of the 1920s and 30s. And this was another way, if you like, of looking at that and seeing how people of the period reacted to it. And the Reading Sheffield, the Reading 1900 to 1950 project is still going on. So in fact, this afternoon we're meeting by Zoom to talk about Jewish literature of the period, which is just one of the subjects for our program this year. It's a really happy bringing together of an interest in the literature of the period and a knowledge of the period that's come to us, I suppose, through our parents, and then connecting that to Sheffield and wondering what Sheffield was like then.
So of course you're connecting kind of social history and to personal history in a way, because kind of that helps you think about the period where your parents grew up. I mean, for me, that's my grandparents, and it's a bit further removed, but it's still really quite close. So yeah, it's one of the things that, you know, by digging deeper into that kind of period, perhaps it might prompt some thinking around, you know, personal histories. And obviously for me, it's a different country as well. So our students might have very diverse backgrounds. So that might prompt a lot of digging, which is great.
I think one thing for me is, and I think this is the same for the others in the group, I lived in Sheffield for 30 years before I started doing this project. And I knew Sheffield, you know, and I would go into the city centre and I knew the Central Library and I would go to that. And I knew vaguely where Hillsborough was or where Walkley was. I knew there were two universities, but I really didn't know very much about the city itself. I knew obviously about its steel making background because everybody knows that. And when I came in the 1980s, Sheffield was very depressed because of the period and the politics we were living through at the time. But I didn't know much about Sheffield, and it stayed that way for about 30 years. But the project has told me so much more about the history of Sheffield and about the people of Sheffield, and I really appreciate that. And the other thing is that although we invented the idea of a reading journey to try to draw out the narrative from our interviewees and to help them tell their story and reflect on their story through the books they had read, we started doing our own reading journeys as well. And that's been really helpful because it's made us reflect on how we got to be the people we are, and the books that we read and what we like to read and how that impacted on us. So if you want to look at the website, you'll find a couple of reading journeys from me. One about when I was studying French at university and lived in France for a year and found the local library, and another one about the libraries that I joined in Gateshead, where I'm from, and where I was, you know, where I lived until I was 18, and was a keen borrower of books from the public library.
So that's the, you know, we might have to go and listen to those blogs, because some of the questions that my students have prepared were actually asking about your own reading journey in a way. So, for example, some of them wanted to know what you enjoy most about reading, and what would you say is the book that's made the most profound impact on your life. So it might be that you're just referring us to the blog here.
Well, I was hinting a bit at that, yes. I'll say it's impossible for me to pick on one particular book or even a number of books. I'd find that very, very difficult. I will say that I mostly read novels. I do read some non-fiction. I'll read history and I read some politics, but mostly I read novels. And I've also found, and this isn't in the notes I was making when I was thinking about this, I've realized that I mostly read books by women. I don't read so many books by men, but that's just, you know, how it happens to be for me. I can't imagine not reading, and I can't remember not being able to read, really. My house is thick with books. I spend far too much money in bookshops. I belong to a library since I was 2 years old, and I'm not even going to tell you how long ago that is, but it's a long time. And I can't really leave the house without taking my Kindle with me and a backup physical book just in case the Kindle stops working. And mostly, as I say, I read novels. And I scorn anybody whose view is that you can't learn from novels. I think you can learn a huge amount from novels. Mostly I read 20th century fiction, I suppose, and I enjoy crime and fantasy novels. I can't be doing with very, very literary fiction, very modern literary fiction. And I'm not very fond of great, thick 19th century classic novels. So that's me.
Yes, I know what you mean. I am a 20th century specialist, so what can I say? Something that's a bit more kind of specific, and this is about the actual project that Reading Sheffield proposed to work with our students. So how did that come about? I mean, how did you think of that? What were the motivations for that?
Well, we've always had a close contact with Sheffield Hallam, and worked collaboratively with Sheffield Hallam on seminars and talks. And this year, until the coronavirus happened, Sheffield Hallam, Reading Sheffield, and Sheffield Libraries were all contributing to a project called the Year of Reading in Sheffield, and we were doing exhibitions and talks. So we've always had a connection with Sheffield Hallam that's been very good for us, and I hope for Sheffield Hallam. This project, when we heard about the opportunity to work collaboratively with the students, really attracted us because it gives us the chance to bring a whole new perspective into the project. We have lots of material that's there on our website. We have lots of questions that it raises, and we have our perspective on it, but we don't have the perspective of a whole different generation, a whole generation for whom a lot of the period we're interested in is history. And it's really good to be able to open the project up to that generation and get them to look at the books and look at the authors and look at the material and explore how much the attitudes have changed, how much beliefs have changed, how much attitudes to reading have changed, and so on. And it's a really good opportunity for us. So we're very grateful to, so many students for being interested in it.
Oh, we're really, really happy to be working with you and also to be learning from you guys. So, I think that's, I find it really interesting that not only are you developing these materials, you're also reaching out to try and diversify the contributions, which seems that to be what you're kind of saying. You kind of, you want it to have a different perspective.
Yeah, in so many ways, I think that's right, because we're largely from one generation, so it's very good to get a different generation's perspective. And then if you look at the interviews that are the heart of our project, which are 65 interviews with men and women, mostly born in Sheffield, all growing up in Sheffield, and born between 1919 and 1946, I think. And they were chosen, not hugely scientifically, but they were chosen to reflect the Sheffield of the period. And now Sheffield has changed a great deal, in part through students coming into the city to study here. And that gives us an opportunity to, to look at a much more diverse range of opinions and experiences. And that's a really good thing that the project can give to us.
Yes, that's one of the things that our students were wondering about, how diverse Reading Sheffield is. And actually, you can't really think about diversity in Reading Sheffield without thinking about diversity in Sheffield itself and how it's changed. I mean, I am, for example, a product of immigration, in the last, 20 years or so. But there's loads of other things that have meant that Sheffield's changed a great deal. And so I'm thinking that this project is a great opportunity to begin to get those kind of different perspectives, not just in terms of different generations, but also different cultural backgrounds and those perspectives that perhaps may be more prevalent nowadays in Sheffield.
Yes, that's a really good thing. And when the students look at the list of the people we interviewed, this 65 people, and when they read about them, they will realize that they come from different backgrounds. There are people from the working classes. There are people who had quite a privileged upbringing. There are people who worked on and lived on the north side of the city, the south side of the city. There are some people who came into the city from outside as children. But everybody, I have to say, is white in our group. And obviously Sheffield has changed a great deal since the 1920s and 30s, when the people we were talking to were born. And that's not to say that obviously there were no Black and minority ethnic people in the city before that time, but there were fewer than there are now. And when we recruited, we did try to reflect the broad background of the city at the time, because that would reflect the history of the period.
And how did you recruit? So did you choose your interviewees, or did they choose you? What was the process like?
They mostly chose us, but we went out originally through Sheffield Library's mobile and housebound library service, which takes books to people who can no longer come to the library for whatever reason. I mean, in our case, mostly it was because they were elderly, and some of them were infirm. They couldn't easily leave their house. So we recruited through that, and then we plotted on a map to see where people came from, where the groups came from. And we saw some places where we didn't have any representatives. So for example, Healy, just outside the city centre, for some reason we couldn't get anybody in Healy. And so we talked to community groups and voluntary groups and community centres and the like around the city, and tried to recruit more people. But it was entirely voluntary on the part of the people who were interviewed. They came in to do it, and we went out to their homes with something of a script and tape recorders, because it was tape recorders in those days, and started talking to them from there.
You must have had to transcribe everything. Oh my God.
Fortunately, I wasn't too involved in that. It had mostly been done by the time I got on board with the project. But yes, it was a huge job. And actually, Sheffield Hallam gave us a little bit of money to pay for a few professional transcribers to do some of the work. And also people's husbands and wives were pressed into service and given headphones and told to get typing.
Good for you.
And then we did have to do a lot of correction as well, because things like a lot of the names of authors and books were just beyond the experience of the people who were doing the transcribing. So there are quite a lot of corrections to do. There were some, I don't know that I want to say this now. There were some very funny errors in transcription. So the one I remember best is Evil and War, Brideshead Revisited, Vile Bodies, Scoop, those novels. And that wasn't EVELYNWAUGH. It was transcribed as the phrase even in war.
Oh, yes. I've had some of those issues with, with all these recordings that I'm making. It's a nightmare.
Yes, well, we had lots of those. We even had a list at one time of the ones that amused us the most.
Oh dear. So obviously it would have been quite difficult. You got what you got in a way.
Yes.
But I wonder if you had any idea of the kind of, the range of diversity of people in terms of, obviously you talked about maybe class and their socioeconomic status, perhaps. In terms of kind of race or religion or gender, did you have any idea, even if it's not, you might not have figures, obviously?
Well, we have, I can give you figures if you're interested. I mean, I can tell you straight away that the vast majority of people were women. And I think that's partly just because women live longer. And all of our interviewees, when we started interviewing them, were over 70, and some of them were even older than that. The oldest was we had two born in 1919, and we started interviewing in 2010. So you can tell that they were already fairly elderly. The vast majority are women. I think it's something like 52 women and 13 men. They come from all around the city, as I say. They come from mostly from a working class background, I think they would say, and they'd say that quite happily. About 4 of them had fathers who owned factories or engineering businesses in Sheffield and were pretty well off. But the vast majority of them, their fathers were manual workers, often very skilled and often quite well paid. But they weren't at all bookish or literary households. And in some cases, reading was the sort of thing that their parents looked down on, and they were told quite often that it wouldn't get them anywhere, or put that book down and get on and do something useful, their parents or relatives would say to them. Others, of course, from working class backgrounds as well, they found that they had parents who in their own right loved reading and found it an escape or a distraction or an education, and who encouraged their children to read. And we have quite a lot of stories of parents, either fathers or mothers, taking their children every week to the library, and while the parents chose adult books, the children are let loose in the juvenile libraries and are having a lovely time listening to stories that the libraries used to tell them, and also choosing their books.
That's fascinating. Probably need to I've listened to a few of the blogs and the transcripts, but I probably need to dig around a little bit deeper, because it's prompted me to think about my own childhood as well, just listening to you. It's really lovely. So there's a few students had a few questions that were a bit more technical, or to do with digging deeper into the kind of what's at the heart of Reading Sheffield. And as well as being interested in the diversity of the people who took part in the project, we're also interested in which is also another type of diversity, but the kind of what kind of educational level they had, and as I think you began answering it as well.
I did, and then I got distracted. I was conscious I hadn't finished saying enough about education. Let me see. A few of them, a very small number, far fewer than you would expect today, went to university. I can think of 4 or 5 of them who went to university, and one actually went to Oxford and read philosophy, politics and economics, one of the top degrees at Oxford. And another one became a High Court judge, and again went to Oxford and read law there. But on the whole, most of them didn't go to university. Secondary modern school or a high school or a grammar school was the limit of their education, their initial education, that is. Remember that in the period, in the middle of the 20th century, school leaving age was less than it is now. So quite a lot of our people left when they were 14 and left with basically an elementary education and not much more than that. And for a lot of them, an apprenticeship was the next thing that they wanted, because that would give you a good solid job in one of the industries that Sheffield is famous for. Quite a lot of them went back to education when they were older through adult education in, say, the late 60s or the early 70s, when their children have grown up and are leaving home. So one woman, for example, whose mother made her leave school at 16 because women become wives and mothers, and that was all this woman was interested in. She wanted to help her daughter prepare. And she forced her daughter to leave school and to go and work in a bank, which the daughter did for years. The daughter got married, her children grew up, and then the woman wanted to go back to college, and she went back to college and retrained as a librarian, and loved it and did really well. So quite a few of our people did that. They have an educational journey that's almost as interesting in a way as their reading journey.
Yeah, so in a way, each journey is individual and unique. Yeah. But is there anything in particular that Reading Sheffield's looking for? You know, you have mentioned that you were originally interested in, you know, kind of that kind of divide between high culture and low culture and how people perceived it. But when you're looking at the reading journeys in particular, are there any aspects of people's reading history that Reading Sheffield is particularly interested in? You know, the kind of thing that when people talk about, you're like, yes.
The thing about a reading journey is that it's very personal. We came up with the idea because when we were looking at all of the transcripts and the audio files, they're very long. And they have almost every word in them that people uttered, and all the hesitancies that people use in their normal speech. And we thought that the reading journeys would be, one, a good introduction to the people, and two, a way for us to interpret some of the things that the material that was coming out of it. So that was why we invented them. And those reading journeys are about, the original reading journeys are about our interviewees. But then it occurred to us that we could start doing our own reading journeys, and which are obviously much more personal. And we realized that they're a really good way of thinking about your own life and your own narrative, your own story, and what's important to you. So what I'd love the students to do is to produce very personal pieces that help them to look at how they have got to where they are today, and to do that through the medium of the books that they've been reading and that mean a lot to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also I was wondering, I mean, I'm wondering, as I'm thinking through my reading journey as we're talking, and so sometimes one might start with a kind of typical questions that what might think might be suitable, but actually by listening or reading some of the journeys that are already there, sometimes that can prompt memories in your own, you know, about your own history. So that might be something that the students might find useful. And I'm just wondering whether that you'd agree.
I do agree. I'd suggest that they look at some of the reading journeys for the original interviewees, and you know, I can help them with that if they can't find them, and have a look at just a few of those, but also have a look at some of the reading journeys by the Sheffield team, which are all on the blog as well. So you'll find a couple there from me and one's there from other people, and to read through those and just see the sorts of directions that we go in and the things that occur to us, and see how they react to those, get them to start thinking. I mean, when it came to the actual interviews with the 65 original folk, we did have an interview guide asking about particular topics. But the thing about a reading journey is that really it's very personal, and it can take you a little bit of time to get into it and to work through it, and to work out what's important to you. And also don't feel that because it's a reading journey that you have to write down every book you've ever read. or every visit you've ever had to a library, and what they meant to you. It's about what jumps out as important to you and why it's important to you. Why do you remember a particular thing that may be a good or a bad thing, but why is it that that's important to you? Think about that.
So, so in a way, that makes the next question a little bit not redundant, but you kind of began answering it in a way, because we were wondering whether there were any questions that you think the students ought to ask each other, and how can they make the most of the interview process. But of course, you're kind of saying maybe we shouldn't be constraining that, and they should be deciding.
I think so, yes. I mean, they do need to record some personal details at the beginning. So, I'm Val Hewson. I was born in 1958 in Gateshead, and I've lived in Sheffield for 30 odd years, that sort of detail. But after that, really, it would be interesting to see what the students think is important to ask, and how, having read some of the reading journeys and looked around the website and the material that's on it, how they interpret that, what they think that would be of interest to explore in their lives.
Is there anything that you would think, I mean, we're going the other way, that perhaps they should avoid recording, particularly if you want to make use of the recordings? I think they're particularly concerned around taboo language, or any specific topics that might be, problematic.
Oral history would say, the discipline of oral history would say no. If people say it, then it should be recorded. It would be helpful, I suppose, if there wasn't a lot of swearing, and I can't imagine why there would be, because you're talking about reading. Why would you want to swear? There are no particular off-topic areas, I don't think. I would say to the students, don't try to make it very formal. It's not a formal process, really. It should be a conversation between you and the student who's interviewing you. And it may take you a couple of false starts before you get going with it and start feeling comfortable. Try to make it a conversation, and try to forget, ideally, just as I'm trying to forget, that Zoom is recording me, that something is recording you as this is going on.
That's really, really useful. There were two more kind of questions that are kind of about the blog, and I'm conscious of the time. Are you okay with?
Yeah, I'm all right. Yes.
Yeah. All right. So the students were wondering where you were more experienced in doing that research for the kind of the author blogs. Where would you suggest they start their research? Where would you go first?
I was hoping you were going to answer that question.
I can answer it at some point.
Well, I would say it's obvious, but you have to start with the author or the text that we've mentioned. And I would guess, looking at the list of authors, I mean, from memory, I know Charles Dickens is on it, and I assume everybody's heard of Charles Dickens, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of the people who are doing the project look at the list and think, I've never heard of some of these, I've never heard of most of these. So hunt out the actual books, and ideally read a couple of them. There are ones in, if you can access the AdSets library, there are ones in the special 1900 to 1950 collection, which you can have a look at, although you can't take them out. You'd have to sit there and read them. And most of them, there are opportunities on Kindle, or secondhand copies, so it shouldn't be too bad. But it's the text and your reactions to them that are the really interesting thing. I don't know about you, but I'm not especially interested in getting potted life of somebody like Lucy Maud Montgomery, who wrote Anne of Green Gables, which is on the list. I know that. I have a book that is underneath the table my phone is resting on at the moment that tells me all about L.M. Montgomery. What I'm interested in is the students' reaction to L.M. Montgomery, how they react, what they think of what she is saying, and you know, how that differs ideally to what the people in our original interviews have said, and how attitudes have changed, or if they agree over time, you know, that it's still the same reaction.
Yes,
Sorry, there are in some cases you'll find plenty of learned academic articles if you do library searches. Some of the authors we've chosen, though, are not particularly academically respectable, so there will be a limit to the amount of material that's available about them. So, you know, you won't find essays from learned professors on lots and lots of them. And then the other thing are primary sources. So have a look at things like the British Newspaper Archive and see what people were saying about these authors and about books, and about spin-offs like movies from the books and so on at the time. Look them up. Go back to what people said then.
That's a really good pointer. But also, I suppose even if they found papers by learned professors, let us say, on Agatha Christie, which they can, they might not agree. No, and that's the interesting thing.
Yeah.
So they might say, oh, actually, you know, they're saying so and so, or they were saying so and so at the time in the newspaper reviews, or, you know, but actually I've just read this book, and my perspective from the 21st century point of view, from somebody who's, you know, their background, this is what I think, and that's really valuable.
Yes, it would be of so much interest to us to find, say, an author or a book that people read and they react to it in a very similar way to the original readers did and to our Sheffield readers did. Or if they look at it and they think, no, this is impossibly dated, it's impossible, it's virtually unreadable, it's offensive in its cultural attitudes. And that it's so interesting to explore those and to see why it's happened. And also I'd hope for the students to reflect on how, you know, to learn how social attitudes and cultural attitudes change over time.
So I would probably, if I was doing this project, I would start by actually reading without any background knowledge, reading the book as if I just picked it up from the library. I don't know what it is. The cover looked good. I'm going to read it, and make a note of all this. And then do the extra research. I think that might be the way I would go about it.
That sounds a really good way to do it to me. Certainly, I mean, as I said, start with the book, read a couple of books by the author if you can, and see what you get from them. This is not, you know, a literary quiz about how much you can find out about a particular author. It's about your attitudes to that author. And looking at how that might have changed over time once you've established what your attitudes are.
So I suppose the one of our final questions kind of sums up what you're kind of saying. Our students were curious to know, how will you find their reading history blog and blogs useful, and also the blogs about the author and topic. So in a way, you're kind of saying, actually, because I'm interested in what you think.
Yes, absolutely. Yes. And as I've said, I think a couple of times throughout this, this project with Sheffield Hallam students opens up a whole new perspective and an angle for us. And it will be really interesting to see our material that we're so familiar with through different eyes. That's what we want from this. And for the students, I'd hope that it would give them a chance to, you know, reflect on their own reading histories and why reading has got them to where they are now, and then to learn about their reactions to literature and authors that they're probably not, I don't want to second guess anybody, but probably not that familiar with.
That's fantastic.
Something else that my students and I wanted to know about was Why do you think that Sheffield has such a distinctive reading history? Is there anything about Sheffield that's different from anywhere else?
Sheffield does have a distinctive reading history. You have to remember that all cities and towns probably have a reading history that's largely unexplored. But Sheffield is unusual because Sheffield is an isolated city. Geographically, Sheffield was always isolated. It was never a county town. It was always, and I'm sorry to say this, subordinate to Leeds in the West Riding in terms of government. And because it's right at the bottom of Yorkshire, again, it was isolated. Its wealth and its reputation were built on two industries, metals and mining. And it had relatively few immigrants coming in, unlike cities like Manchester and Leeds. For various reasons, it never really developed commerce or much of a legal profession or marketing or a lot of what used to be called white-collar jobs. And within the city as well, it was isolated because of its geographical makeup. Sheffield, as you all know, is built on 7 hills, they say, and there wasn't a great deal of interaction between the people who lived in the different areas. And a lot of the areas, most of them, certainly on the north and the east of the city, and to some extent on the south, there was a lot of poverty. So it became a city where there wasn't a great deal of, there weren't a lot of cultural resources in the city. There was a public library service, there were always some theatres, there was, thanks to a philanthropist, there was a university, but it was a very different city to somewhere like Manchester or Leeds or Birmingham.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I didn't know that isolation played such a big part in Sheffield's reading history. So I've learned something today. Thank you very much. I've got a final question that's a little bit more personal again.
Okay.
So one of our groups was saying, so in the project brief states that all the group members of Reading Sheffield found a pleasure in reading that changed how you lived. So they were curious to know in what ways has reading and being a member of Reading Sheffield changed or impacted the way you live your life. And I'm wondering whether they're thinking, might this change my life? So can you give us a little bit about it? I know it's a little bit personal.
No, that's fine. I said I think that most of the people involved in the project were not born in Sheffield, although we've lived here for most of our adult lives and worked here, and that we came to Sheffield because we worked. I know I said before that I had come to Sheffield and worked here for years, but not really known the city very well. So one thing that it's given me is a much deeper knowledge of the city. Even just geographically, there were parts that I hadn't been to, but I found I would have to get on a bus and go and look at the library, the branch library in that part of town. So I went on lots of new buses and lots of new places in Sheffield and learnt how the different bits of Sheffield fit together. But it did help us appreciate Sheffield much more and learn much more about it. And I think it probably deepened our affection for the city that most of us have called home. In my case as well, I started off in the 1980s doing postgraduate research, long time ago, but there were no academic jobs around. And so I became a civil servant. And then 30 years later, I've come back to, I think, what I should probably have been doing all along and not been a civil servant, even though this was in a different subject, in a different language, in a different century to what I was doing originally. But it's lovely to have come back to doing research and to have found, in a way, a new home in doing the project. So that's what it's given me.
That's fantastic. And that's so hopeful, I think, in that it's kind of, the module that we kind of, that this project is embedded into is an employability module. but you're kind of also saying, actually, you know, you can use those skills for your job, but also there's life after work. There's something else you can do. You can use them for other stuff, for life, for things that you actually really enjoy.
But yes, I mean, there are skills that you learn at university, and there are skills you learn through doing research and through your reading that will be of enormous use to you when you are in work, whatever that job is. I mean, whether you're in teaching, or whether you're like me, you become a civil servant, or whether you become an engineer or whatever, there are so many useful skills that you learn at university from doing projects like this. I mean, one example would be, you know, working collaboratively with other people, because when you get into work, the first thing everybody says to you is, now teamwork is very important. Do you know how to be a good team player? And you know, that's the sort of thing that you can you learn at university, I think. Not only at university, but you know, you do learn it then. Yes,
that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Val. It's been really informative, and I think it's going to be very, very useful to our students, and it's certainly been very useful to me to learn a little bit more about the background of the group and what it is that you know, you're looking for in this collaboration.
I'm happy to help. If anybody's got any more questions or anything, I mean, I'm only here at the end of the phone line on my sofa.
Thank you. I'll show this to the students on Friday, and I'm sure they're going to be delighted. And there's loads here that we can work with. Thanks a lot, Val.
Good. I'm happy to help. We all are. We're really interested to see what comes out of this.
Thank you.